G'day everyone, welcome to Lubrication Explained. Alright, so today we're going to talk about the huge fire that happened in the US, in Illinois, in a town called Rockton. You probably saw it all over the news, and if you've been following this channel, you would have understood that we're already seeing shortages in the lubricant and base oil supply chains. So what kind of effect is this going to have? First of all, need to highlight that no one was injured in this explosion or fire, which is a real testament to the evacuation procedures that they obviously had on site. Fantastic news that no one was hurt. From all reports, the firefighters did an absolutely fantastic job. I believe one of them sustained minor injuries during the incident, but it's really good to hear that everyone's health and well-being is going to turn out fine in what was an enormous blaze. One thing I don't want to kind of gloss over, though, the fact that there are going to be a lot of livelihoods that are ruined as a result of this. I'm sure there were a lot of people, there were 70 people that were evacuated, but typically, in towns like this, there are a lot of industries that spring up that supply the manufacturing plant. And so the impact is going to be felt more broadly in the community, and I don't want to diminish, the job loss that's going to happen here, because especially post-COVID, there are a lot of people who are doing it tough, and to be set back like this is not a trivial thing. So just wanted to acknowledge that before we kind of move along to kind of the global impacts. And, one thing that you might have wondered is, who on earth are Chemtools? Not necessarily a brand that you see out in the market, not in the same way that you would hear about, Shell, Mobil, Castrol, but they're definitely an important part of the overall lubricant supply chain. One of the reasons why you might not have heard of them so much is that if you go to the website, you'll see that they do have their own branded products. They seem to specialize in greases and metalworking fluids, but they do a lot of private label work. So what do I mean by private label? Well, it may well be, and I'm not making any assertions here because I don't know for a fact, but it could be that Chemtool, for example, make greases on behalf of one of the majors. So maybe, if you open up, a Shell grease cartridge, it might be that the grease inside was manufactured by Chemtool. And this is very common especially in the OEM space. And when I say that, think about the car manufacturers or the truck manufacturers. Someone like Volvo or Scania, they have their own range of lubricants and greases. Well, we obviously know that Volvo and Scania do not have a grease plant at their disposal. So typically they'll go to a company like Chemtool, and Chemtool will make greases and put the Volvo label on it or something like that. Right? I'm not talking about Volvo specifically, I was just using them as an example. Now, the thing about Chemtools and this specific site was that they were one of the largest manufacturers of grease in the US, which might have come as a bit of a surprise to some people. But Chemtool is actually owned by a parent company, which is called Lubrizol. And Lubrizol is a little bit more famous in the chemicals and specifically in the lubricant and greases world. Lubrizol is a huge chemical and additive company. So what do? Well, they concentrate on the part of the lubricant which is the additives, right? So it's that 10% of very specialized chemical additives. Lubrizol, along with companies like Chevron Oronite and Infinium, Afton Chemical is another one of the big ones. They specialize in the production of those additives. So think of your anti-wear additives, your ZDDP, your EP additives, antioxidants, all that kind of stuff is made by companies like Lubrizol. And Lubrizol, I think in 2013, acquired Chemtools. Now, as it happens, Lubrizol is part of the Berkshire Hathaway group. So in a weird way, this Chemtools explosion actually links back to, two of the most famous investors in the world in Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett, because they're mostly ownership of the Berkshire Hathaway group trickles down through Lubrizol and then into Chemtools. So it's kind of an interesting link there. Now, what are kind of the let's say, ongoing ramifications that we're going to see from this. I've seen a few comments on one of my previous videos that, oh no, we've had this huge fire. What's that going to do to lubricant supply and demand? But if you remember, what's the difference between like an oil and a grease? In terms of composition, it's the thickener that's different, right? So there's maybe 20 to 40% of a grease is made up by the thickener. But in the past, what we were talking about was base oil supply, right? So it's this component. And if anything, you should think of a grease manufacturer as being a buyer, right, of base oil. So in a very small way, this is actually going to increase the supply of base oil out in the market because a buyer has been taken out of the market. So that's sort of a counterintuitive way of looking at it. Then, of course, there's the additive part. They're also going to be requiring less additive. Now, it is going to put pressure probably on the grease supply. Depending on what kind of quantities that they were doing, maybe there's a bit of pressure. But I think, certainly in my experience, we haven't seen the same pressure on grease availability that we necessarily have seen on lubricant availability. So I don't think that this is going to have material impacts on the market going forward. There might be some transitional impacts, though. So going back to the kind of corporate ownership, you've got to remember that when an event like this occurs, like a really big potential safety event, typically what a large manufacturing company would do is that they would have some kind of safety stand down, right? Where maybe they instruct all their workers that we're going to have time off the job, we're going to address the incident, and because the Chemtools Corporation is owned by Lubrizol, that might be something which is done Lubrizol-wide, right? And you've got to imagine, and again, without knowing the details, you've got to imagine that there's going to be a pretty in-depth investigation that's going to take up a lot of time. Presumably, there's going to be some kind of safety stand down. Maybe there's more processes that they put in place to ensure that this doesn't happen again. And what that could ultimately do is slightly slow down production of things like additives and greases in the short term. So maybe it will have some effects on the market in the short term, but I think long term, given how big the global supply chain is for lubricants, greases, and additives, at first glance, it doesn't look like this is going to have a major impact in the way that some of the macro trends that were triggered by COVID. It's maybe not to quite that same level. So anyway, short video today. I just wanted to address the current events. So if you've got questions or comments, as usual, please leave them down below. Otherwise, this has been Lubrication Explained.